Chapter 35. Darkness Stirring. Moll scrambled down the tree, her eyes blinded by tears. The clearing was a blackened wasteland, the sacred oaks charred with ash, but Oaks's gypsies ran back and forth from the river, beating down the flames with pails of water. Oak rushed over to Moll. "Okay?" And she knew what that meant. They were going back for Griff. She watched as Siddy tended to his father's wounds. Then she scoured the clearing for Alfie, but he was nowhere to be seen. Dread crept in. Perhaps he'd realised they didn't stand a chance now, and the thought of returning to Skull's camp had thrown up fresh fears. It was Raven that Moll spotted first, entering the clearing ahead of Alfie as he led Jinx and Oaks's cob towards them. "Figured there's not a chance we're letting the Shadowmass take Griff, so I fetched the cobs." Moll tried to smile, but an emptiness was growing inside her, filling the space where Griff had always been, even if she didn't know it until now. They swung themselves up onto the cobs. "Wisdom, get the last of the flames out, then we'll see to the wounded with Siddy," Oak cried. "Ma'll help you." Driving the cobs through the trees, they galloped through the river and raced into the deep wood. The stars above them seemed to fade, one by one, as the darkness grew. Moll clasped the amulet around her neck tight as they galloped through the beeches, past the dead owl and the pierced rat. There was no sign of the vapours this time, but somehow the air felt heavy, not with rain, but with something much, much darker. Alfie's body was hunched with fear, and Oak had cocked his pistol, but Moll didn't notice. Griff's absence burned within her. She'd get him no matter what. They pulled the cobs back to a trot, then picked their way through the last of the trees before Skull's camp. A low, almost strangled laugh escaped through the branches towards them. "Tie him up on the ceremonial table, Hemlock!" Skull shrieked with pleasure. The three of them edged forward and peered into the clearing. Enormous torches lit up a long wooden table. A giant bat had been carved into it. Its painted black wings unfurled across the surface. Only then did they notice the trees ringing the clearing. Moll gripped Jinx's reins tight. They were unmistakably alive. Their trunks leered forwards, their branches twisted into tendrilled arms, their roots knotted into mangled feet. But the worst thing of all was the faces. Gruesome heads bulged out of the gnarled bark. Troll heads with bat wings for ears, goblin faces with wild boar snouts, werewolves with snake tongues, warlock heads with wolf fangs, and they were snarling, growling, licking their lips in gleeful expectation. Moll seized Oaks's arm. "They're tree ghouls, aren't they?" Alfie froze. "Tree ghouls?" Even Oaks's body was rigid with fear. "The vapours! Skull must have trapped them inside the trees. And when you trap the broken hearts of the witches, their curses are said to seep into the vessel that carries them." He urged the cobs back several paces, and then in a low whisper he said, "Stay well away from them." But Moll's words fell short. Skull and Hemlock were approaching the table, wrestling with a bundle of rope and fur. Moll watched, her body tearing its side as she remembered what Oak had said about Griff years ago. Wildcats will fight to the death for their freedom. They are what it means to be really free. Pah! Griff was stamping his forelegs and hissing through his teeth. He flung himself against the ropes, and the tree girls cackled and groaned around him. The ache inside Moll grew, pounding inside her throat. But the tree girls moaned, and into their cries Griff began to yelp. Hemlock tossed the bundle of wildcat and rope onto the table. Then, seizing a hammer, Skull drove several nails into the ropes, fixing Griff fast. Bound on his stomach, his limbs splayed, Griff gnashed his teeth and jerked his head from side to side. And then the chanting started, low and deep, as Skull and Hemlock circled the table, their masks in shadow, their hands held high. Mole clenched her teeth, ready to fight the dream snatch, but it never came. What followed was different, darker. Tonight we summon you to finish our chant. Master of the soul splinter, do what we can't. Come from the shadows, the gloom most dim. Use curses of power, deadly and grim. For here lies the beast, the one we all need. Join with us now and make this cat bleed. Believe us, the girl is not far away. She'll come for him soon, the last of our prey. Somewhere in the night sky, far above them, something was stirring. The darkness seemed to thicken, and the tree ghouls screeched with pleasure. Alfie turned to Oak. We go, you and me, into the clearing to fight for Griff. And leave me here, Mole hissed. I'm not sitting by while... It happened so quickly they could barely draw breath. A tree ghoul ripped its roots from the soil and lurched towards them, swiping out with a withered claw. Mole screamed, ducking beneath it. It crunched down, rupturing the soil, and she fell from Jinx. Oak and Alfie spurred their cobs forward towards the clearing. Use your dagger on Griff's ropes, Oak yelled to Alfie. But the tree ghoul lumbered forward, wrenching them from their cobs, stringing them up in the air like puppets. Run, Mole! Oak screamed. Get away from here! Mole scoured the trees for Jinx, but she was gone. She looked towards the ceremonial table, and then she met Griff's eyes. He blinked hard at her. There's still hope, Mole, he seemed to be saying. Hope? Mole thought. What hope is there in all this? Griff tried to raise his head, but the ropes held him fast, and all the while Skull and Hemlock muttered around the table. The summoning was almost complete. Come to us, Darkbite, the child is near. Drop from the darkness, feed on her fear. Mole cowered in the shadows of an ordinary beech. Just meters from her, a tree ghoul grunted as it overturned the undergrowth in search of her. Alfie and Oak wriggled and slashed at it with their daggers, but it wounded them over and over again in its branches, like a spider binding a fly. And above the clearing, the darkness was gathering, conjuring a high-pitched screeching of its own. Bats, thousands of them, swarmed overhead, swelling, growing, bulging into a terrifying shape. A figure was materializing, made entirely from the bats, and it throbbed high above them. Darkbite, the third shadow mask and the master of the soul splinter, had been summoned. Tears streamed down Mole's cheeks. If she ran in to try and save Griff, the shadow mask would kill her, and the bone murmur would be broken forever. Everything her parents had fought for would have been in vain. She caught Griff's eyes, and the tears fell fast. You're going to be okay, Mole, he was saying. She could almost feel his thoughts. Silent sobs wrapped Mole's body. Maybe this was how it was meant to end. Griff's life for her own. He'd saved her once before, and now he was doing it again. The figure of Bats was throbbing with screeches, hollow, like a dead man's call, and it was sinking towards the table. Mole clutched the 3 feathers inside her sheath. Look, protection. And she looked up at Alfie and Oak. Friendship. She gripped her pa's dagger tight, then throwing one last glance at the tree girl, crashing through the undergrowth, meters from her, she darted into the clearing. Another tree girl thrust down its claws, but Mole leapt between them, racing on towards Griff. Hemlock and Skull looked up at her, laughing behind their masks. Above them, the bat figure slid nearer still. Griff looked at Mole, his yellow-green eyes large and scared. Ember, a voice inside Mole called, almost so weakly, Mole wondered whether she'd heard it at all. Ember, it said again, and somehow Mole knew that this was her pa, willing her on. Her mind whirled, and then she remembered the carving above the wildcat's head in the heart of the forest. She gripped the amulet for all she was worth, rubbing her thumb over and over the jewel. She felt a surge of hope, a hope so strong she could practically taste it. But the descending figure, still more bat than human, was settling on the ceremonial table, two enormous leathery wings unfurled over Griff. The amulet seemed to tingle inside Moll's fingers, and it was glowing again, as it had done in the heart of the forest, coating the whole clearing in a turquoise veil. Skull's eyes locked onto the amulet. "Stupid child! You think that's going to help you now?" Moll swallowed. What did she expect would happen if she rubbed the amulet? Hemlock glided towards her, his mask a wall of stone. Moll stumbled round the clearing, closer and closer to Griff, gripping the amulet and her pa's dagger tight. The turquoise light was brightening now, crushing the darkness back. Clinging to a shred of hope, Moll tore the necklace off and held the amulet high. "You can't take Griff away from me," she shouted, "because we've got things more powerful than the Shadowmass ever dreamed of." She shook the amulet for the Shadowmass to see. "We'll never give up on the Bone Murmur. We'll save the old magic." Moll was trembling, but she could feel her pa's voice inside her, urging her on. Hemlock ran towards Moll, and she rubbed the amulet harder and harder. She looked at Griff, the longing bursting up inside her. Hemlock advanced still closer, for at once there was a thunderous crash, followed by a tumult of screeching, as the winged figure on the table crumbled into thousands of bats that tore off into the shattered sky. Hemlock stopped, his eyes suddenly wild with terror. The ceremonial table had split in two, and Griff was scrabbling out of the net, tearing back the ropes. He shot free and bounded over to Moll, flinging himself against her. Moll held him tight, and their hearts clamoured together, beating with love and pain. "The amulet!" Oak roared as the tree girl that held him bashed him against the branch. "Hold it up again, Moll!" Skull's and Hemlock's heads were bent low. Moll raised the amulet high and staggered backwards, her dagger ready. Griff limped into a circle around her. He was cut and battered, but his teeth were bared. The two Shadowmasks edged forward while muttering their curses, and, with every step they advanced, a terrible pain split through Moll. Griff growled and spat. He could feel it too. You won't win," Moll stammered, rubbing the amulet harder. "Nothing good can come now you've cut away your souls." There was another deafening crash, followed by another, then another. All around them the tree gulls were splitting down their centre, smashing forward in crumpled heaps like giant stacks of bones. Alfie and Oak, finally free, raced towards Moll and Griff. The Shadowmass was centimetres away from Moll and Griff now, but their bodies couldn't fight what came next. The blue light from the amulet seemed to thicken into mist, and it curled around Skull and Hemlock, tearing at their masks, ripping them away to reveal their faces. And they were the most terrible faces Moll had ever seen. The skin was sickly grey, and it hung in shriveled folds, writhing with maggots. The mouths and noses were just slits, like gashes in rotten skin. Moll recoiled in horror. Then the turquoise mist began to claw at the Shadowmasks' necks. Their bodies contorted in vicious spasms, clinging backwards. Skull clutched at his face, almost tearing the skin from his scalp. "Get away from me!" he howled. "Get away!" "Darkbite!" Hemlock cried. "Come back to us!" His body jolted into another spasm. Moll's eyes widened, but Darkbite didn't come. The Shadowmask's eyes were bulging whites, rolling with sunken skin. Moll's stomach churned. Beetles, large and black, were spilling from the Shadowmask's mouths, and, as the mist tore at them, their bodies began to shrivel. The mist grew brightening and thickening until it was all that was left of the Shadowmasks were two masks, a skull and a face of slate. and then 2 rasping voices hissed through the clearing towards Mole. "Darkbite will come back to you, the master always does." A shooting pain pierced through Mole sharper than anything she'd felt before. She stumbled to the ground, clutching Griff and the amulet to her. The voices muttered on, knifing at her skin. "You can take our bodies, but you can't ever take our souls. We're locked inside the soul splinter. We'll never really die." Summoning the last of her strength, Mole crawled forward and stabbed the mask with her pa's dagger. The voices crumbled into hisses like thousands of tormented snakes before dissolving into the dawn. Pain seared through Mole. The forest around her was fading. Oaks and Alfie's cries, just voices in the distance. But the clearing, it was changing. The mist was glittering now, and it couldn't be. It was melting into water, settling as a sparkling lake. Mole could feel herself slipping further away. The amulet was wriggling inside her palm again. She tried to hold it, but it struggled free. She seized the chain, trying to draw it back, but it tugged against her fingers, and as it did so, Mole heard her pa's voice somewhere deep, deep inside her, beyond the pain inflicted by the shadow masks. "My Mole, you've done it! You've won the first amulet and beaten back Skull and Hemlock." The amulet pulled harder and the chain dug into Mole's fingers. "I love you, Mole, and I'll always be with you." The voice was silent for a second. "But there's a time for everything. So long as my soul is down here with you, it's trapped by the damage the soul splinter did to it. You must let me go." Where will you go?" Mole sobbed. "The stars, Mole. Every star is a soul watching over us, and I'll be looking down at you. Always." Mole felt for her pa's words and held them close. "I love you, Pa," she whispered. "I'll never really leave you, Mole." "I know." Clinging to the echo of his whisper, Mole let the amulet slip through her fingers. She felt a strange lightness, as if a weight had suddenly been lifted from her. The amulet floated upwards, hanging above the lake like a miniature moon, and then one by one, like falling stars, lilies whiter than snow dropped from the sky onto the sparkling water. The amulet, dazzling blue, hovered for a few seconds more, and then it drifted upwards, up, up into the sky, higher than the forest, higher than the furthest mountain peaks, higher than the moon, until it rested up in the heavens, the brightest of all the glinting stars in a gathering blue dawn. Mole tried to cling on to what she was seeing, but she was falling too fast now, tumbling down into bottomless black.